We finish, as always, with Fridays with Thurber. If you're unfamiliar with this ritual, it began when I would read these stories to my late father in the hospital. He suggested I read them to you. To my great honor, the Thurber family enthusiastically agreed, and here we are. Thurber served in World War I and was a code clerk in Paris during the peace talks. He was supposed to go to Switzerland. You'll discover why in this abridged reading from The Beast in Me and Other Animals from 1948 he did not go to Switzerland. In a story about 1918 that, as ever with this extraordinary humorist, speaks to us as if it had been written yesterday. Exhibit X by James Thurber. I had been a code clerk in the State Department in Washington for 4 months during the First World War, before my loyalty was investigated. If you could call my small, pleasant interview with Mr. Shand an investigation. He had no dossier on Thurber James Grover, except a birth certificate and a draft board deferment paper. In 1918, Americans naively feared the enemy more than they feared one another. There was no FBI to speak of, and I had neither been followed nor secretly photographed. The snooping photographer could have caught me taking a code book home to study one night and bringing it back the next day, an act that was indiscreet and properly regretted when I learned the rules. But a pictorial record of my activities outside the Bureau of Indexes and Archives in Washington would actually have been as innocent as it might have looked damning. It would have shown me in the company of Mrs. Nichols, head of the information desk at the State War and Navy Building, a psychic lady I had known since I was 6. George P. Martin, proprietor of the Post Cafe, and Mrs. Rabbit, his assistant. Frank Farrington, a movie actor who had played the part of a crook named Brain in The $1 Million Mystery, and Jack Bridges, a Los Angeles airmail flyer and Hispano-Suiza expert. I doubt if any such photographs, even one showing me borrowing $20 from Bridges half an hour after meeting him for the first time in my life, would have shaken Mr. Shand's confidence in me. Mr. Shand called me to his office about a week before I was to sail for France and the Paris embassy. He was a tall, quiet, courteous gentleman, and if he had only one question to ask me. He wanted to know if all my grandparents had been born in the United States. I said yes. He wished me Godspeed. We shook hands, and I left. That's all there was to it. Waking up at night and looking back on it now, I sometimes wonder how I would have come out of one of those 3-man inquisitions the State Department was caught conducting last year. Having as great a guilt sense as any congressman and a greater tendency to confession, it might have taken me hours to dredge up out of my mind and memory all the self-indictments that must have been there. I believed then, and still do, that the generals of the Southern Confederacy were, in the main, superior to the generals of the Northern armies. I suspected there were flaws in the American political system. I doubted the virgin birth of United States senators. I thought that German cameras and English bicycles were better than ours. And I denied the existence of actual proof that God was exclusively a citizen of the United States. But, as I say, Mr. Shand merely asked me about my grandparents, and that was all. I realize now that as a measure of patriotism, the long existence of my ancestors on American soil makes me more loyal than Virginia Dare or even George Washington, but I didn't give it any thought at the time. Before I sailed on the SS Orizaba, a passenger ship converted into an Army transport, and looking rather sheepish about it, I was allowed to spend 4 days in Columbus, Ohio, and my mother has preserved, for reasons known only to mothers, a snapshot taken of me on the last day of my leave. The subject of the photograph is obviously wearing somebody else's suit, which not only convicts him of 3 major faults in a code clerk: absent-mindedness, carelessness, and peccability, but gives him the unwanted appearance of a Saluki who, through some egregious mischance of nature, has exchanged his own ears for those of a barn owl. If this would not be enough to cause a special agent to phone Hoover personally, regardez, as the French Sûreté would say excitedly, the figure of this alarming indiscret. His worried expression indicates that he has just mislaid a code book, or what is worse, has sold one. Even Mr. Hoover's dullest agent could tell that the picture is that of a man who would be putty in the hands of a beautiful or even a dowdy female spy. The subject's curious but unmistakable "you ask me and I'll tell you" look shows that he would babble high confidences to low companions on his third Pernod à l'eau. And this man could even find some way to compromise the Department of Agriculture, let alone the Department of State. The picture would have aroused no alarm in the old days, however, for it is almost impossible to be a security risk at the State Department of 1918, no matter how you looked. All our code books, except one, were quaint transparencies dating back to the time when Hamilton Fish was Secretary of State under President Grant. And they were intended to save words and cut telegraph costs, not to fool anybody. The new code book had been put together so hastily that the word America was left out. And code groups so closely paralleled true readings that love, L-O-V-V-E, for example, was the symbol for love. Whatever slight illusion of secrecy we code clerks may have had was dispelled one day by a dour gentleman who announced that the Germans had all our codes. It was said that the Germans now and then got messages through to Washington taunting us about our childish ciphers and suggesting on one occasion that our clumsy device of combining two codes in a desperate effort at deception would have been a little harder if we had used two other codes, which they named. This may have been rumor or legend, like the story current at the time, that 6 of our code books were missing and that a 7th, neatly wrapped, firmly tied, and accompanied by a courteous note, had been returned to one or another of our embassies by the Japanese, either because they had finished with it or because they already had one. I had been instructed to report to Colonel House at the Hotel Crillon when I got to Paris, but I never saw him. I saw instead an outraged gentleman named Auchincloss, who plainly regarded me as an unsuccessfully comic puppet in a crude and inexcusable practical joke. He said bitterly that code clerks had been showing up for days, that Colonel House did not want even one code clerk, let alone 12 or 15, and that I was to go on over to the embassy where I belonged. The explanation was, I think, as simple as it was monumental. Several weeks before, the State Department in Washington had received a cablegram from Colonel House in Paris, urgently requesting the immediate shipment of 12 or 15 code clerks to the Crillon, where headquarters for the American peace delegation had been set up. It is plain to me now what must have happened. Colonel House's cablegram must have urgently requested the immediate shipment of 12 or 15 code books, not code clerks. That's Countdown for this August 6th, 2010. Portions written by James Thurber. It's the 2,654th day since President Bush declared mission accomplished in Iraq, the 2,243rd day since he declared victory in Afghanistan, and the 109th day of the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf. Rachel Maddow and The Rachel Maddow Show next. I'm Keith Olbermann. Good night and good luck.